Hello, and welcome to the last session of our class on AI images. This has been a lot of fun for me, and I wanted to spend some time in our last session bringing together all of the threads that we've been pulling apart over the course of this semester. It's helpful to start by remembering that there's ultimately no such thing as a quote-unquote AI image. There are many different ideas of what each part of that means. There's different ideas of what AI is, and there are many different systems involved in what AI is. Even when we narrow things down to GANs or a diffusion model, there's a lot of different pieces and parts of those systems. And every layer of these systems seems to introduce some new controversial position, a new controversial action. And there's also arguments about what images are. Where do images come from? What do they represent? And of course, the argument about what images are art, what counts as art, when does an image become art, and why? And of course, the idea of art doesn't make things any easier. So, where do we go? Well, we've pulled a lot of these systems apart, and today I want to thread all of these things together. And I think it's helpful to review 4 systems that connect together when we are making an AI image using these diffusion models and GAN-based tools. The first is data, the images in the data set and the way the data set was assembled. The second thing is the interface. This includes prompts, but it's also the screens. It's the way the user interacts with the data set. What do they move through in order to get images out? So that's the way we access data, the interfaces and the prompts. The third is the image itself. This is the result of the data and the user and the interface coming together in interaction. An image emerges from those 3 pieces, right? You need all 3 in order to get an image. And then finally, once that image is out and in the world, there's the question of artistry. And this, I think, is the 4th system. What exactly is creative agency? Where do we consider attribution for these images? And we will unpack a lot of these today in our final lecture. So, let's start with data. Data is the core of these generative systems. Without data, there's no image. Without data, there's no model. So this means we can start asking some important questions right at the start about these images. The first is, what is this data? Where does that data come from? How is it selected and processed? With generative adversarial networks, or GANs, this was more straightforward, because GANs were trained on data that was compiled into specific datasets. They could only extend patterns that were found in that dataset. So if you wanted pictures of people, you had to build a dataset of people's pictures. These datasets would then be used to train the generative adversarial network. You can look at a GAN, and you can see the images it produces, and you can make sense of what the underlying dataset was pretty easily. If it's making pictures of faces, you know it's trained on images of faces. If it's making pictures of cats, you know it was trained on pictures of cats. If you knew what the data was, you could go in and you could look at it. You could find the dataset, open it up, and look at the pictures that were used to make these images. That was giving us some transparency into the system. Again, if it's trained on people, we can look at the data and see what those people looked like. We can ask questions about the diversity of that dataset. We can ask questions about whether those pictures of people were given with permission. When datasets were assembled correctly, we could also identify the exact sources of those images. We knew that the FFHQ dataset came from Flickr, for example, the one that was used in StyleGAN and StyleGAN 2. These datasets were often assembled by people, sometimes workers getting paid pennies on the dollar to identify, download, or crop those photos into specific formats that would be useful for the models. Generative adversarial networks use this data as a training source. So here we could say, well, what does it do with that data? Well, if we remember, a generator creates an image, and then another part of the system, a discriminator, accepts or rejects that image by comparing the images of the generator to the training data set. If the generator sends something that looks like it could be in the training data, then the discriminator allows that image to pass through. It passes that success or failure information back to the generator, which then replicates successful patterns while introducing novelty and variation. So then it goes through this new level of training, this training epoch, or steps, as you saw in your runway experiments. The more training, the more aligned the generator is to the training data. At a certain point, though, it can learn a kind of perfect image and stop varying its output so much. It stops learning and it just starts to constrain what it generates. You just replicate, essentially, a single image that sort of passes through the generator, or passes from the generator and goes into the discriminator, is compared to the data set, and it stops learning because it sort of knows exactly what it needs to do. That's referenced as overtraining. Anyway, that's GANs. But then there's diffusion models, and there's a twist on this process. It's important to note that the data sets used for GANs are still around in training a diffusion model. These data sets of faces, for example, that used to just produce faces in the GAN way of doing things, are still being sort of absorbed into diffusion models. But a diffusion model will process these a little differently. It's no longer just images. It's images and the text associated with those images. So you have the images and their captions. It could be metadata. It could be alt text, all from the web. So the question of what is the data becomes far more complex with diffusion models. The answer on one level is that the data is something like Leon 5B, which drives stable diffusion in Midjourney. Leon 5B is a dataset. It's information collected about pictures alongside their captions. It's not the images themselves. It's the information about how the subjects of those images break apart and how they might be reconstructed. The Leon 5B dataset is that information with URLs. This data is collected through images being broken down into noise. When they start, the model knows nothing. The model sees nothing, and to be clear, it really doesn't learn anything. It follows instructions, a recipe for turning an image into a series of numbers. The image is encountered and categorized by the caption associated with the picture. Information is stripped away from this image, and noise appears where that information used to be. So these pictures are slowly breaking down. But this information is stripped out in a way that allows the model to identify a pattern. Gaussian noise follows a pattern where it tends to cluster around the densest part of an image. This reduces that image to coarse shapes. But the model also walks backward to the starting image. So when the image is completely obliterated, it can trace a frame of pure static back to that original picture. It doesn't store the picture, but it stores the information about that breakdown in a way that makes it accessible through text, through prompts. It's categorized. If you upload a picture and label that image as a flower, the model would break your flower down into noise, learn to move from that noise back to your original image, and then it would send that path or store that path in a kind of abstract category of flowers, where it joins hundreds of thousands of other paths from hundreds of thousands of other images. This data was not selected by human beings in the sense that there's not a person who moved it from the World Wide Web into the model. That was the way we did it with GANs. This process is automated, meaning it was the result of a human decision to automate it. That human decision to automate this meant that they were willing to accept a number of compromises about what got into this model and how it operated. As we've seen, a lot of problematic content is present in this dataset, including pornographic images, white supremacist and Nazi imagery, and racist memes with captions. It includes misogynistic content, such as categorizing the word professor with white men. This is a key result of the way the data was assembled and organized. Even though a human wasn't involved in making those decisions, a human was involved in saying that no humans would be involved in making those decisions. The decision to automate was a human decision. And with 5 billion captions and text pairs, it can be really hard to understand and unpack the result of that decision. It's hard to see what the information was in that data set. There are also a lot of questions out there about whether this data was ethically collected. Much of it is being contested as a violation of people's copyright. Getty Images is suing Stability AI for using this information in their dataset without their permission. Getty Images being a company that sells photographs. So a handful of artists and illustrators are also suing Stability AI, and their work is in this dataset too. There's something called Creative Commons licensing, which gives people the right to use your images under certain conditions. You apply this to your images when you upload them. You say, I'm uploading this, I'm sharing this, go ahead and use it for these purposes. If you'd like to use this for a different purpose, let me know, and we'll talk about it. Some see the model and all of the information it learned about these images as copies of their images, the way that an MP3 file is a compressed copy of a musical performance. So they see it as a copy. And so this copy, arguably, could be considered part of the commons licensing for research, where it's considered fair use, or it could be an illegitimate copy of a photo being made in a new kind of compression algorithm. So you could say, and some do, that the data about how the image breaks down is the result of legitimate research, that it is fair use of the data about your image under Creative Commons licenses. There's the claim that the model is the result of research, so it's okay. They also note that the model doesn't contain images. It contains links to images with their descriptions. That dataset is open as research and free to use, but critically, the images themselves are not. So you could look at Layon 5B and see, oh, there's not a single image in here. You could also look at Layon 5B and say, oh, it's a list of links to images. There's a big distinction there, and much of the legal theories and outcomes are going to rest on how that's interpreted. The other question is the business of selling the use of that model. Is that a whole other sphere of activity from the people who made it? What's the relationship between the research side of Layon 5B and the business side of Layon 5B when you start selling the products of that research? So again, it's all very complicated, and it leads to questions about whether AI is stealing from artists or built on theft from artists. And hopefully, based on what we've discussed in this class, you have your own ideas, or you feel informed enough to be uncertain about where you stand, and know how to follow this as more legal cases and use cases start to come out. As I've said many times, it's very early. So that is a summary and review of the data parts of the system and their related controversies. So next, I want to talk about the interface of the system, the prompts we use, and the ways we use those prompts, the ways that it asks for those prompts. And here we're going to focus strictly on diffusion-based systems. So we're moving away from GANs because GANs don't have prompts. When we write a prompt, we are writing a caption for an image that doesn't exist yet. And the diffusion model is searching across all of its many abstractions to find clusters associated with the words in your prompts, each of which accesses a certain category of its dataset. So remember, it's breaking down images of flowers, it's finding these sort of common clusters associated with that as a keyword, and then that as a category, a flower. When you write a prompt with the word flower in it, you're saying, show me something, create something from the information in this category of flower. The nice way to put this is that it is breaking objects down into a generalized form. And when you're asking for an apple, it can pull information about all of the apples it has seen and how it reversed the process of those apples breaking down into noise. It walks those apples images into noise, figures out how to walk those images of noise back to the apple, and then you get a random frame of noise. And it walks a random frame of noise back to something called apple. The data that is stored as apple, the category of apple. The model walks this random noise backward toward an image of whatever you've described in your prompt. It is a noise reduction algorithm for an image that is only noise. It is reducing noise on an image that doesn't exist. The only information it has about that image is the information in your prompt. If the noise it starts with is random, it's pretty unlikely that it will walk its way back to any specific apple that it has ever encountered. But it will walk its way back to a kind of core concept of an apple, drawing from a kind of composite made of all possible apple shapes that it has encountered. Breaking objects and people down into core essences and then assigning categories to those core essences is a stereotype. And creating images that literally limit the range of photographs to align with those stereotypes is no big deal when you're making an image of an apple. It's okay to say, show me a stereotypical apple. But it can be a bigger deal when you're creating images of people. Human captions on the internet often include things called invisible categories. We've discussed before how a wedding is the word used to describe a straight couple getting married, but when a gay couple get married, it's often referred to as a gay wedding. There's a tendency among captions online to have this kind of normative shape to them, in which white men are not labeled as white men in photographs, but everyone else is identified with a kind of modifier. We do not have white presidents, but we certainly had a black president. We don't have people that we refer to as male doctors, but we often refer to people as women doctors. I want to be careful about this. I'm not endorsing that happens. I'm saying that this language is reflected online. It is a result of human biases. And these human biases are absorbed into the model because we are relying on human descriptions of images. And humans have biases. And therefore, our descriptions of images have biases. And therefore, the images that we are pulling out of the data set reflect biased language. These are stereotypes. And that gets taken into these categories and can reinforce that bias when they generate new images that follow the same rules. We have another issue with the prompts, which is that it's very easy to activate the styles of particular artists who appear in that dataset, many of whom are still alive and working. So there is a question about directly typing an artist's name to get an imitation of their style, which we see often, not just with illustrators, but also with directors. A lot of reimagining of certain movies in a particular film director's visual style. So one example is Wes Anderson's The Shining. Or we talked early on about Alejandro Jodorowsky's Tron. These are famous directors, and their styles are very unique, and they're being paired with other intellectual property. The Shining and Tron are both owned and written by people, and we're putting them together. And when it's someone who's quite famous, then arguably they have more power. They can withstand this kind of satirical, playful reimagining of their styles. But when it's a relatively obscure illustrator or artist with a particular visual style that they have worked an entire lifetime cultivating, it can have the effect of something akin to abuse. That visual style is a part of their identity and livelihood. So flooding the internet with images that look like theirs, or like bad knockoffs that come up but still have their name associated with them, that hurts their livelihood. And if it happens enough, it can really hurt people who are working to make images. We saw about the fantasy author who no longer could, or illustrator who could no longer find their own images when they Google their name. And of course, nobody else could find their original images either. They could only see the AI knockoffs. So this infringes on identity because artists making work are making work from experiences. It's also infringing on the memory of artists. and the work that artists have made, the legacy of artists. And it's infringing on their vision. At this stage, there are a lot of ways to work with this. And it's hard to argue that every use of these tools is an infringement on an artist's work. So I'm encouraging that we think carefully about what we're typing, what we're doing, and what the images stand for. But we'll get to that a little later on. At this stage, we are talking about a kind of middle ground between the prompt and the resulting image. And so we will go into a conversation about what these images are and what they mean and how they circulate in the public sphere. But before we do, I want to discuss this interface a little bit further. We also talked this semester about the imagination and how our interactions with technology exist in a kind of imaginary place. We type a prompt that asks us to dream or to imagine, and that hides the reality of what's happening behind these models. And the imagination of how these work relies on a kind of shorthand. It's saying that, oh, the machine is an artist, or the machine is dreaming. And these are metaphors. They're relatively harmless for simplifying the process. Nobody wants a button labeled something complicated and complex. But what's important to remember is that these buttons are labeled that way for a reason, and that those reasons do include hiding aspects of the model that might be objectionable to the user. Asking a machine to dream is much nicer than asking a machine to scour a data set of other artists' drawings and make a new drawing for you based on that style. So it's very easy to type in, make a dream in the style of some obscure artist, right? Rather than make an artwork that derives its style from a obscure artist. And these decisions about design hide the flaws of these systems, and they hide the controversies of these systems. They can also make people mistake the metaphor for reality. Even very smart people have become convinced that AI is a sentient actor simply because the text box says, I am a sentient actor. But I want to talk again about this idea about theft, which is kind of the common accusation hurled at these systems. We talked about theft in the data set, the ways the data set could be construed as theft, and it's important to bring this up again, because there are two ways that people talk about these systems as theft. The first is in the data layer, that it took information without permission and built a business around that information, and artists whose work were used were never compensated for their contribution of information or time. Never compensated for the training data they provided, or their work putting all of their work into a single place with labels that the information could go find and use. You have assembled data sets. You know it's a pain. And so when an artist has put up a website with a bunch of their images and labeled those images, and the machine has gone and said, oh, thanks for the data, that isn't what they were intending, right? So that's where this idea of theft comes in. There's different questions about whether that's ethical versus whether it's legal, versus it's a nice thing to do. But this is the argument. So that's a suggestion that the companies selling these AI-generated images as a service have kind of stolen this information from the artists, have built a business model on the backs of artists who don't see anything in return. The companies argue that they are using a model created for research purposes, then that they had nothing to do with building that model, so they shouldn't be held accountable for how that research was conducted. There are a lot of layers of additional nuance here that we cannot get into and are unresolved, including questions about how distinct that funding of the model and the companies really is. All of that is connected to the collection of data that we've talked about. The second layer of this theft accusation comes from the use of these images, and that is the idea that people prompting images in these systems are supporting the additional theft of images from artists. There are two takes, the first of which is kinda, to be honest, just wrong. That stems from a misunderstanding of how these models work, that they're somehow remixing artists' work or cutting and pasting pieces of artists' work. As we've seen, that's not quite true. The other argument, which is more compelling, is that even if you ask for an image that isn't associated with a specific artist contributed to the images that you're making. So for example, you could prompt the system with a reference to Garfield, the lasagna-eating cartoon cat by Jim Davis. That is an obvious infringement. That is obvious theft of Jim Davis's style. But you could do the same thing with a far more obscure cartoonist or web illustrator, and it's not quite the same relationship. Nobody's going to mistake Garfield for yours. But we'll use Jim Davis as an example, and we'll use Garfield as an example. So you could prompt Garfield and get images of Garfield. Very obvious that you are taking Jim Davis's intellectual property and work. On the other hand, you could also prompt cartoon cat. Instead of saying Garfield, you just say, show me a cartoon cat. And you might get a cat that looks nothing like Garfield. And obviously, you can look at these two and you can say, neither of them look like Garfield. But the point is that they are both informed by Garfield. And you can actually say, to some extent, that one looks a little bit more like Garfield, while the other, the Garfield comic, looks more like Jim Davis's style. Comic strip cat looks like Garfield, even though we haven't asked it for Garfield. The cat itself resembles Garfield. It's obviously gone through a process of abstraction, right? We are not looking at Garfield. But when we look at Garfield comic on the left, we see that element of style, of Jim Davis's style, and that Garfield style, even if the cat doesn't really look like Garfield. In either case, the information is in there, and it's being pulled into the thing that we do see. But these images are pulling from an abstract space of all cartoon cats, and part of that infrastructure, part of that abstract space, is Garfield. So the output may not look like Garfield, but the training data includes Garfield, and the vision of cartoon cat is built on having encountered Garfield. It's informed by the existence of Garfield as image information that has been sorted into the category of cartoon cat. The argument is that you're benefiting from work created by Jim Davis, and that Jim Davis is not getting compensated for that. Think about the work you did in putting your data set together. If you found out that someone was using that data set to make a product that made a ton of money, would you want to be compensated? This is especially true if you built that data set out of your own artwork. Now, these aren't the only images in the data set, of course. There's also public domain works, and works by people who just don't care if you use it. But the current interface doesn't allow you to cut those out. It doesn't allow you to prompt only from public domain images, or only from images that people have said, go ahead and use them. Some people are working on this, and Stability AI and Stable Diffusion are working on an opt-in system, and we'll see how that goes, and we'll see if anyone uses it. But it is interesting to note that when the design of this data set and process of collecting images was set loose on the internet, the status of public domain was never categorized. It categorized almost everything else, but it didn't categorize public domain in a specific way that allows you only to prompt for the public domain, which is interesting. It's not a reliable category. So there's decisions made. We call it an automated process, but there are decisions made about how that automated process went out and did things. And those were human decisions. So finally, the interface is also a site of a system-level intervention. So remember, we're talking about an interface and the interaction we have through a software interface to the data set. And one of the things that happens is these companies that offer those interfaces can kind of intervene. So if you type a prompt, the system intervenes in a few ways. There's safety filters. So Stability AI and Midjourney won't return pornographic or violent imagery, right? DALL-E 2 doesn't either. If you do it through Hugging Face, you get these blurred images that censor things that it decides look sort of too erotic or risque or violent, and it blurs them so you can't see what they look like. It still gives them to you, doesn't charge you for their generation, but weirdly enough, you can see them. They're just super blurry. In the case of OpenAI's DALL-E 2, there's also research that suggests that they insert random diversifying words into your prompt without you knowing it. And that way, these invisible categories that we talked about in the data set are challenged on the back end. So if you type professor, DALL-E 2 will add the word black or woman or some other modifier to this word in order to diversify the results on the other end that the user sees. And so these are system level interventions. What the companies allow you to access, what the companies allow you to see, what the companies modify about what you're requesting, and how it returns these images. It can be interesting with Stable Diffusion to see what it censors, and sometimes things get censored that do not really need censorship, like really abstract images I've seen get censored, but also sometimes it doesn't censor, it misses things, which is very interesting, and I don't know why that happens, but it does, though I'm not going to show them to you for obvious reasons. So these are the interface level interventions that mediate the way you can explore the underlying data set. And ultimately, you're still steering your way through the data set with your prompts through this new layer of systemic level intervention. So your prompt goes through the interface into the data, essentially, or into the abstract model that has been created based on the data. So that's the interface. And now this brings us to the fourth system, which exists around these AI images, and that system is human culture. It's the notions of creative agency and attribution. These are cultural, they're social. Each of us is moved or repulsed by different images, and these images reflect who we are, what we grew up with, our experiences as people. And there's a lot of controversy around whether these images are art. And a lot of these ideas about whether they're art focus on kind of unusual ideas of art. One of them says, well, you typed a prompt into a text box and you got a picture that's not art. But this ties the idea of art to a kind of outdated process of craftsmanship, which is still valid. I'm not saying it's not valid. But we have had a long history of art where people literally pointed at things and said, I say this is art. And this has been going on for 100 years. It started with Dada in Zurich in the 1910s, 1915, 1917. You turn a urinal upside down and you say, this is an artwork. Art can be made in 30 seconds or 30 years. Art can be created by pure luck or chance. It can be created through highly focused and sustained attention to detail or haphazard doodles on a napkin. Art can be created by mistake or with purpose. The value of an image as art is entirely subjective, and we will never arrive at a concrete consensus around what art is. And let's be grateful for that. Because the moment you start concentrating a definition of art, you really narrow down the possibilities of what art can be. You narrow down the possibilities of new media emerging and new ways of thinking about art emerging. So I want to move away from this question of, is it art? The answer to that question, universally amongst almost every time it's asked, is that it depends. But these images do exist in a context, and that context around artificial intelligence is inevitably shaped by their engagement with these ethical questions and these sort of moral questions that we've encountered about how the systems work. You can make art that ignores them, you can make art with them that ignores this context, or you can make art that engages with them. We've seen a lot of artists in this class who talk about their relationship with it. Some of them are more engaged with the critique than others. And all of them are, I would say, making art. And artists have always grappled with the complexity of their tools. We think about things like painting as very established. We think about things like photography as very established as an art, but a lot of these things had controversies. And we explored some of those in the readings around photography in particular. But I want to talk about something a little different, which is, does an AI see the way that a human sees? Is an AI inspired the way that humans are inspired? You'll hear, and you may have heard, that they do. I am often told that AI systems see the world of images and learn from them, that they create new images from what they have learned. I'm assured by many that this is precisely what human artists do, that there's no difference between an artist being inspired by the images that an artist sees and an AI being inspired by the images that an AI sees. But just like that dream button or the imagine commands, there's a form of shorthand involved here that reduces a very complex social and cultural and even biological reality down into something that feels to me a little too simple. I think reducing what artists or photographers or illustrators do to what a machine does is tempting as shorthand. It makes things easy to understand. But ultimately, it obscures the actual mechanics of what's going on, and it obscures the experienced reality of artists and image makers. Every encounter a human has with an image occurs within a context. We see images on billboards, we see them in museums, we see them online, we see them on TV, and there's differences in how we encounter these images and when we encounter these images. We see them when we're on our way to an exciting date or when we are coming back from a disappointing one. That changes the way we interpret that image and the way we remember that image. It shapes that memory of that image. We see pictures of our dog and we see pictures of some stranger's dog that we've never met before. We see medical records in a TV drama, and then we can see an x-ray of our uncle's lungs on a doctor's office light board. Those are very different experiences of images that are otherwise the same. The experience of an image matters. It creates associations and feelings. It creates emotional responses. When images are juxtaposed or placed in a sequence, we might read them as a story. The story of those images is a projection of our associated experiences with similar images or similar things that are depicted in those images. It reminds us of something. And it reminds us something emotional, of experienced, seen, felt. We can connect these to previous lived experiences. We interpret them based on their alignment to those experiences. When we look at an image, like we saw with advertisements, are the people in the image meant to be us? Or is it meant to be somebody else? Am I supposed to aspire to be the somebody else in that image? Is it meant to be seen by someone who has never seen a kind of world like that before? How do we respond? Who has crafted this image? What do they want me to do with it? Do I want to read it the way it was intended? Do I want to have a sarcastic response to the image? Or do I want to say, that actually looks pretty cool, I want to go do that? Do I want a little bit of both? Would I like to read it differently than the way it is intended to be read? That's my agency as a person, as a human being, to make those decisions and internalize images and experiences according to the way that I want to internalize them, and according to a logic that is uniquely my own. We don't just encode and decode images, we use them to tell our own stories. And without these stories, these images are just data. They're latent, unactivated visual information. But because we activate these stories in our heads, we negotiate what these images mean against the meaning that was written into them by whoever made them. And that's the individual interpretation of these images that I think is so important. In our lecture on advertising, we talked about Stuart Hall, who noted there was something called a hegemonic understanding of images. The ones that are shaped through frequent use and description by authorities, from the law to politics to media to our parents. These hegemonic understandings become naturalized. And this doesn't have to be super high level. In the United States, for example, a red traffic light means stop. To function as a society with a shared understanding of the world, we all agree that this traffic light, which is just a light with the color red, that it means stop, that it means something, that a light in a certain color flashing has a meaning. We share this meaning. That's a cultural and socially agreed upon interpretation of a flashing red light, which in and of itself means nothing. Red, of course, has no meaning outside of how we've learned to read it. We process images through our eyes and into our memories, but we also process images through our memories. We see emotionally, we see through lenses we've learned and unlearned. When artists recreate what they've seen, it's been molded by those experiences. They are making images that are a result of this mixture of direct information from an image and this personal interpretation of the image. We might see an image and abstract it and regenerate it in some new form. That may be what we say an AI does, but there is something very different about what is actually happening when a person does it and when the machine goes through those steps. There's more than visual data in the mix. There's this old saying, this old story about a designer who could sit down and design a brilliant logo in 30 seconds. And someone asked, how can you do that so fast? And her response was that it didn't take 30 seconds. It took 30 seconds and 30 years. In other words, it was her experience. It was the way she had learned to see things that led her to create that work so quickly. And yeah, AI generates images quickly. I don't think that's any reason to discount it as art. What's missing from this instantaneous generation of a picture by the system is a lived experience. Humans bring that, and we may choose which images make sense to us through our own experience. And that can include images that are generated by an AI system. But that isn't the AI's experience. The agency of the AI, it's not a thing. The AI is mixing elements of information together and putting them together into a picture, and it's up to us to say, I see this as a story. I see this as an artwork. It's very hard to say that the AI is intending that, especially when you look at how they work, how they've been designed, and what they're actually doing in comparison to the things that an artist does. And I would issue a caveat that this definition of experience is not in and of itself a requirement for art. So yes, I'm going to contradict myself here. Early in the semester, we talked about George Brecht and his desire to strip the human completely out of the process of art making. And this avant-garde tendency has played with methods of stripping emotion out, of making objective art for decades. And I'm not suggesting that this is not art, or that an AI cannot make images that can become art. I'm simply suggesting that an AI does not see the way we see. It is not inspired the way that we are inspired. But that's okay. Despite this easy option out of the AI can't be an artist trap, this idea, when someone says the AI can't be an artist, there's a tendency to say, well, no, look at the pictures. Look at how beautiful the pictures are. Or these pictures are emotional and profound. And that's focusing on what the images depict rather than the actual reality of how they're interpreted, right? The image could be anything, and we can interpret it any way we want. And that's why this definition of art is so slippery. To me, there's something far more interesting about asking how these images play with the systems that make them, how the artist who is generating these images is interacting with the system to get something out of it. I like hearing about human expression, and part of that human expression could be, how do we strip humans out of art making? To me, that's still an interesting story, and it's an interesting human story. And those things are not completely contradictory. So, again, an AI system might make images that are art, it might not, but what shapes that answer is never as simple as what tool was used to make it or how fast it was made. There's an allure to saying that these machines see the way that humans do or are inspired the way that a human is. And I think it's partly shaped by two simplifications. The first is the simplifications of how humans see. When we spend too much time in sort of programming environments, thinking about computers and how they think, and trying to boil the world down into this series of steps and actions that can go into a program that a computer can follow, we tend to have a tendency to think reductively. And it's very easy when we are in the habit of reducing these kind of actions down into series of steps to think that everything in the world can be subjected to that process and come out unscathed. And so there's a lot of these mythologies that ultimately everything is potentially reducible to a set of instructions for a machine to follow. And we can see all things as equally eligible. But I think we should challenge that. I think we should ask questions about whether everything can be reduced to a program and a set of instructions to follow. Whether all human activity and behavior can be stripped of emotion and rendered into an objective series of steps or a large enough scaled neural network. The second simplification is a refusal to accept that there are, in fact, different ways to see and experience. In other words, diffusion models see in their own way. And these ways are fascinating. They're poetic, even. They are able to see information break down to absolute obliteration and then walk backwards from total obliteration to an image. And they can create new images by doing that. They're able to move backward from a frame of random noise into a picture. And that's cool. I think you don't have to lose that by saying that it is engaging in an act of artistry or that it is an act of inspiration. I think we don't have to apply a human metaphor to this machine's process. And I actually think that, of course, applying the metaphor of human vision to the system is really tempting to sort of simplify things. But it's also reductive, not just of humans, but it's also reductive of the system that we're trying to describe. It's actually really human-centered to say that there's no other way to incorporate an image into memory. It's possible to say that an AI does not think or feel, and to accept that we might find interesting new tools for the way our own imagination can encounter images in the world by looking at how diffusion models do it. We can actually kind of empathize with the what and how that a diffusion model is engaging in and think about that for ourselves without necessarily giving it away that we are human and without necessarily saying that this machine has to be behaving in a human way. It seems to me that when it comes to new technologies, one of the most important things we should aim to do is to see how they work as clearly as possible, stripping away metaphors that might confuse and complicate things in the long run. The benefits of this clarity also help us avoid what I think is a really big risk around AI, and that's the risk of dehumanizing ourselves. Seeing human vision and human artistry and inspiration as a mechanistic system is literally dehumanizing. It says that we are machines, that we operate like machines. It suggests that we are NPCs, non-player characters, those video game characters that play out a script on a loop, existing only for the sake of one human player moving through the world. And if we adopt this kind of simplistic thinking about machines and people, the idea that we function like a complex computer, it ignores the messy entanglements of everything that goes on, all of the relationships we have and all of the emotions that we feel. Humans don't think like machines. We don't think like the Leon 5B dataset because the Leon 5B dataset does not think. Humans in and of themselves do not even share one way of thinking. There is no quote unquote human way to think. There's a wide range of diversity in the ways we see, the thoughts we think, the things we feel, the ways we make sense of the world and the ways that we don't make sense of the world, which is equally important. And it's important not to dehumanize people, obviously, but we also learn a lot by resisting the urge to de-mechanize machines. We can aim instead to understand their logic, their structures, and the patterns that they use. And those things are contributing to the diversity of the world that we live in. These are complex mechanized processes, and they can be embraced as parts of the systems that we're entangled with, rather than a replacement for all that entanglement. Saying that machines think and that humans must think like machines is saying that there's one way to think, that even the machine can't escape the way that humans think. But there's not. And if we accept that a dog can think, but that it doesn't think like a person, and we can accept that an octopus can think, even if it doesn't think like a person or a dog, then can we look at a machine and say it's doing something? And what it's doing doesn't have to be categorized as intelligence or thinking or sentience in any way. To be super simple about it, maybe a machine is just doing its own thing. And maybe we can aim to understand that thing for what it is, instead of by comparing it to ourselves. If we do, we might identify better strategies for managing these machines' coexistence within our social and ecological systems. We can have relationships with things, even if they can't have a relationship with us. So, on that note, I really hope that this class has given you a feeling of some firm footing around all of the questions and complications of this new emerging space, and to make sense not just of AI images, but of the claims around artificial intelligence more generally. I hope when you come up against claims about these AI systems and what they can do and what they can't do and what they will do someday, that you can think critically about what's being said, and importantly, that you can find your own conclusions about how you want that technology to be used in the world around you. And I hope you found some things you agree with in this course. Obviously, I hope that you found some alignment in the things that you've been hearing, both from me and from the visiting lecturers and artists and the articles you've been reading. But I also hope you found something to disagree with and that you want to challenge and that have encouraged you to dig deeper into some of the things you disagreed with and want to challenge and want to interpret in your own way, because that is one of the wonderful things about being a person. And yeah, that's a cool thing about this space, is it's still emerging, it's still changing, and all of us are still learning about it. And I encourage you to think critically about everything that's been presented here and to find your own way through it, but also to stay open-minded and curious about other ways of seeing it. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks again. Keep in touch. Bye-bye.